In today's episode, Natalie and I interview Gabe Brown, who's one of the pioneers of the current soil health movement, which focuses on the regeneration of our resources. Gabe, along with his wife Shelly and son Paul, own and operate Brown's Ranch, a diversified 5,000-acre farm and ranch near Bismarck, North Dakota. The ranch consists of several thousand acres of native perennial rangeland, along with perennial pastureland and cropland. The ranch focuses on farming and ranching in nature's image. So without further ado, here's our interview with Gabe.
Hold up, one more thing. If you have not yet scheduled your 45-minute free exploration call to find out what the root cause of your symptoms are and your next steps to getting symptom free, you are going to want to pause this podcast and go do that right now. So I invite you to go to nutritionwithconfidence.com, book your free exploration call, and find out how to get your results. And again, for joining us today. So, as a nutritionist, I'm very aware of the health crisis that humans are facing today. I mean, 1 in 3 people are pre-diabetic and they don't even know it, right? And then breast cancer is affecting 1 in 2 individuals. So, I was wondering if you could start off by explaining the connection between our health and regenerative agriculture.
Well, thank you. It's great to be with you. So, our health is intricately related, of course, to what we eat, but what we eat and the nutrients that are available in what we eat is explicitly tied to soil health. And so, when we talk about regenerative agriculture, we're talking about not only soil health, but ecosystem health as well. So it takes into account many different things, but we have to realize that we are what we eat, whether we like it or not. That there's so much truth to that, and unfortunately, over time, what's happened is we've gone to more ultra processed foods, and as the health of the ecosystems has declined, so has our health.
Yeah. Will you speak more to monoculture farming, like industrial agriculture practices, and the connection there with processed food consumption?
So what we saw is after World War II, they took many of the munitions plants that were building munitions for the war and converted them into plants that produce nitrogen fertilizer. That nitrogen fertilizer allowed farms to increase production, and they did that in a way that they farmed more and more monocultures, which means only one crop was grown at one time in a particular field. That, along with plant breeding, everything was geared to more. We need higher and higher yields. And they used it under the guise of, well, we have to feed the world. And they're still saying that today. Well, it's a ridiculous point, so to speak, considering the fact that latest statistics I had were from 2022. We produced enough food to feed 10.3 billion people. And of course, there's a little over 8 billion on the planet. We're producing way over enough food, but the problem is that we're not producing the right type and kind of food. And then what happened, getting back to your question, what happened as we put a greater and greater focus on monoculture production and increase yields, we did so at the cost of ecosystem function. In other words, we actually destroyed and led to the degradation of our soils. And it's through the soils that plants get the nutrients that inevitably become nutrients for our body. So monocultures are one small part of a larger problem, but they certainly are a part of the problem.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'm familiar with another study that talked about, I think it was in 50 years, the nutrients in plants today and food today that we're growing is a lot, there's a lot less nutrition in those
Mhm.
foods. And so you're saying that that's because of what we've been doing in our farming practices and how we've been growing our food. And it comes from
Yes,
the
and
soil.
the study you're quoting is that from David Thomas, and it's a very famous study. There's many others out there. And I think first it's important for the listeners to understand, how do plants get nutrients? Okay. Uh most listeners will think that, well, the nutrients come from what farmers put in the soil. And to a small degree, that's true. But what they don't understand is they're made available to plants via biology. So it's the biology in the soil that actually consumes nutrients. Their bodies are made up of nutrients. They come to a plant to feed off of the root exudates. In other words, that plant taking in sunlight, photosynthesis occurs. It uses part of those compounds for growth. Part of it translocates to the roots, where it exudes these out into the soil. They're called root exudates, and they're carbon compounds. And it's the microbiology in the soil that comes to feed on those carbon compounds. In exchange, then, what happens, there's what we call the predators of the soil, your protozoa, nematodes, etc., feed on those bacteria, and then they release and excrete excess nutrients. Those are the nutrients available to the plants. So the plants rely on soil biology to acquire its nutrients. Now, what happens if we're using copious amounts of synthetic fertility, or if we're applying, stored animal manures, etc., even if we're applying, say, waste from a city treatment plant, and we're putting that out onto the land, that has to go through biology first. And if a farmer or a gardener is using these synthetic nutrients to, they think, feed the plants, what they're really doing is making the plants very lazy. The plants then do not excrete as much root exudates. Thus, there's less nutrients available to the plant. And the important thing is for listeners to understand, it's the diversity and the array of these soil microorganisms that determine the array of phytonutrients in plants.
Mhm.
So what we're finding with the work that scientists are doing now is that the diversity of the ecosystem, in other words, the different plant species, animals, insects, plus the diversity of soil microbiology, determines then the diversity of these phytonutrients, which inevitably we consume, and that's what drives our gut microbiome. So the life in our gut, that microbiome, which determines to a large extent our health, is intricately related to the diversity and the health of the soil microbiology.
Absolutely.
And Gabe, I thought we could go to your story a bit. And it's my understanding that you used to practice more conventional agriculture practices, the use of these synthetic fertilizers
Mhm.
you've referenced, tilling. Could you speak to a bit of your story, how you got into agriculture, the practices you were starting with, and then we can go from there?
Sure, I'd be happy to share with you. So my story, I was born and raised in the city of Bismarck. I was not from a farm or ranch, but I took an interest at a young age. I took a vocational agriculture class when I was a freshman in high school, and I knew that's what I wanted to do with my life. I was really interested in production agriculture. Started working on farms and ranches, and I actually started studying in college to be a vocational agriculture instructor. Well, as luck would have it, I married my college sweetheart. She was from a farm, and her folks want to know if we were interested in coming, but moving back, taking over the farm. My wife said she left the farm in order to get away. You know, she married a city kid in order to get away from the farm, and here I drug her back to it. So I learned to farm from my in-laws who were very conventional minded and realized no fault of theirs. That's the model that was being taught by land grant universities, extension, you know, everywhere they turn, that mantra of let's plant monocultures and focus on higher yields, concentrate on less diversity of a crop rotation, get the animals off the cropland. Those are all, that's how I learned to farm. So my wife and I were able to purchase part of the ranch from them in 1991, and we started farming that way. But one thing about me, I tell people I'm a lifelong learner. The more I know, the more I know I don't know. And so I want to learn more. And I had studied about no-till. It made sense to me, save time, save moisture. So in 1993, we sold all of our tillage equipment, bought a no-till drill, started no-tilling the crop. So we weren't disturbing the soil. And that's very important for ecosystem function, because remember, the soil is the home to all that biology, and which I didn't know then, but I know now how important it is.
Yeah, and
And
Gabe, just
so,
to interject real quick, will you explain like what tilling is? Maybe there's someone listening who's like, I don't even know what tilling is or why farmers would till.
sure. So tillage is the act of disturbing the soil. And most people are familiar with gardens and how many people who have a garden, they rototill that garden to prepare. They think they're preparing a fine seed bed where it's easier to place the seed into the soil. Farmer tills for the same reason, plus to control weeds, just like you go hoe a garden to control weeds. Well, what you're really doing is destroying that structure of that soil, the ability of that soil to infiltrate water. And think of it this way: there's more microorganisms in a teaspoonful of healthy soil than there are people on this planet. So when we go rototill a garden, when we go hoe a garden, we're destroying the home for billions of microbiology, the same microbiology that bring those plants the nutrients that both the plant and us needs. So that's tilling the soil. So I stopped tilling there in 1993, 1994. We had a very good crop. Then what happened to me, 1995, the day before I was going to start harvesting 1,200 acres of hard red spring wheat, we lost our entire crop in a hailstorm. So financially, very devastating to us. 1996 came along, we lost 100% of our crop again. So it really set us back even more financially, and realized farmers, ranchers, they borrow large amounts of money every year in order to pay the rent, buy the inputs, in order to put the crop in, etc. Well, our banker wasn't wanting to loan us money anymore. My wife and I took off farm jobs. 1997 came along, we dried out. It was a very dry year. Nobody harvested any crops. So 3 years, no crop income, further and further in debt. 1998 came along, we lost 80% of our crop tail. And it was very hard to live through, put us very deep in debt. But I tell people it was the best thing that could have happened to us, because even though it was very difficult, what I was observing and learning then was that our soil was actually becoming healthier. Because what happened, those hailstorms laid down a large amount of biomass, armoring the soil, covering it so it's not prone to wind erosion, water erosion, the moisture. And we're in a semi-brittle environment here in North Dakota. We get about 10 to 12 inches of rainfall a year and another 5 to 6 inches from snow. So about 18 inches approximately of precipitation a year. It's important that that water infiltrates into the soil, then does not evaporate away, because it needs to last for the entire growing season. So those 4 years, put us in debt financially, but I started to observe we started to get more earthworms showing up in the soil. Wildlife was returning to the farm, more birds and deer and all these other animals. That's all a good thing. That showed me that, hey, they're coming back for a reason. And then also, because the bank wouldn't loan me the money to buy fertilizers and chemicals, I was learning how to farm without that. And what I noticed over time was I really didn't need to add those things in order to make a profit. I was becoming more profitable, okay, without buying all those inputs. Now, was my yield as high? Did I grow as many bushels of grain? No, but my profit was higher. And I tell people, I'll take profit over yield any day, because
Yeah.
profit keeps me in business, yield may not. So over time then, and I'm accelerating things, I learned more and more. I learned about cover crops and how to integrate animals to graze those cover crops and how to diversify the crop rotation. And it's become known today as the 6 principles of soil health that drive the 4 ecosystem processes. And now, no matter where I go all over the world, the processes are the same. The principles are the same. Now, the tools we use, in other words, what crop, what cover crop, what species of animals we put on the land, that may vary according to where we're at. But the principles and processes are the same everywhere. And so now I spend a great deal of my time traveling all over the world teaching these principles and processes.
And I'd like to get to these 6 principles of soil health that you mentioned, but before we shift, I'm so struck that you had 3 seasons back to back that were just devastating. 4 seasons,
Four
four
seasons.
seasons. And you're in debt. Like what kept you going? I heard you say that you were noticing some positive shifts
Yeah.
with the no-till practice. Was that what? Because in the 90s too, I'm from what I know, there weren't many folks, if any, who were doing no-till regenerative practices. So you didn't really have too much of a template.
Well, yes, good questions. And what kept me going? 2 things: faith, no doubt. I had faith. I really believed that God was showing me something because I was seeing earthworms. I was seeing this life. I was feeling good. Now, I tell people we were $1.5 million in debt in 1998. That is a pile of money back in 1998 for a young family who had bills to pay and mortgages, etc. But truth be told, the more I learned, and I learned early on one thing about me, because I'm not from a farm or ranch, my eyes are always open to other ideas. So we were so strapped financially, it did not pay economically for me to grow and raise the same thing as everybody else. I just couldn't grow spring wheat and sell it. I needed to find crops that had higher value that I could sell for seed, for instance. Instead of just selling our beef animals at the sale barn, we raised bulls and sold breeding stock to other producers. I needed to find higher value. And so I say faith and stubbornness kept me going. That and a good wife who, for whatever reason, was very understanding and put up with it. I also tell people, realize I think I was just too young and dumb to know any better. Now, my wife and I are both college educated. We could have found other jobs, but this is what I really felt I was called to do and what I wanted to do. And so once we got past those 4 years, we started to make money to the point we kept the bank paying them money, so that showed them, well, no need to foreclose on them. They're making their payments now. And then things accelerated and got better each year. And I tell people it really was a blessing those 4 years because it opened my eyes to a whole nother way of production agriculture. And many people say that, what we call regenerative agriculture today is what indigenous peoples all over the world did centuries ago. Yes, to some degree, we're doing it a bit different now with the technology that's available, but it is the same from the standpoint observation, understanding what the ecosystem was trying to tell you. If we see a quote unquote weed, we know that's trying to tell us something. It's there for a reason. We need to be smart enough rather than just going and get chemical and killing it. We need to be smart enough to understand, okay, why is that there? And then perhaps it may mean just letting that weed go and heal the reason it is there. Just let it go. It'll take care. Nature is always self-organizing, self-regulating, self-healing if we allow her to be.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I can imagine, I'm like, hearing you talk, I'm like, why aren't more farmers or doing these kinds of practices? So it must have, I wonder how difficult it is for a standard farm to stop tilling and start transitioning like that. What are they up against?
Yep, great question. And realize there is major changes being made. And I'll give this as an example. There was people no-tilling back in the 1970s. They tried it, some stuck with it, some didn't. When I started no-tilling 1994, I was really the first no-tiller in our county to do it full scale. Now, 80% of the land in our county is no-tilled, so that's caught on. What hasn't caught on as much as some of these other practices. But I tell people this, because I get asked that question every day, and it's a good one. If it's so good, why isn't everybody doing it? Well, farmers and ranchers cannot implement what they do not know. Okay? I have 2 college degrees in agriculture. My son has 3. So there's 5 college degrees in agriculture. Never, ever once in any of our studies did the professors at the college talk to us about these regenerative practices. Okay? County extension agents, they don't talk about it. They're starting to now, but they didn't back then, right? And we have to remember, why did production agriculture change after World War II? The consumers were demanding copious amounts of low-priced food. Well, they have copious amounts of low-priced food-like substances because Gabe refuses to call what's produced today food. If food nourishes the body, unfortunately, and I know I'll catch a lot of static for this, especially from my farming friends, but most of what is produced today, as you said earlier, is not nutrient dense. It just does not nourish the body. If it did, we wouldn't have the prevalent illness that we have today.
Absolutely. And you mentioned you were in that much debt, right? So I'm sure there's risks too of, the farmer has to have enough to invest into this change. That's not just financial maybe, and you had more than financial. So how long do you think it would take for someone to get out of debt, or for you guys?
Yep, let me address that now. So my wife and I have a son, Paul, who's 37 now. And Paul, immediately after he got his 3 college degrees, he came back to the farm. That's all he's ever wanted to do was farm. Okay. I had promised him that when he was 30 years old, we'd turn the farm over to him. So I kept that promise 7 years ago. And what I did, along with Dr. Alan Williams and Ray Archuleta and David Brandt, we formed a consulting company called Understanding Ag. And Understanding Ag educates farmers and ranchers as to this process, how they can go down their regenerative journey. So I can answer this question because fast forward in 7 years, we've grown Understanding Ag from 0 acres to we just surpassed 36 million acres we're actively consulting on. And that's all across North America into South America now, England, Ireland, Sweden. It's becoming a global company. And we're very, very good. How do we go from 0 to 36 million? We're extremely good at increasing profitability for our clients. So what we do, and this gets back to me saying they cannot implement what they do not know. We show them on their own land where they're at, do proper soil testing, do split trials. By that I mean we have them do part of a field the way they've always done it. Then according to our recommendations, they farm the other part of the field according to what we're recommending. We show them increased profitability. We show them improved water infiltration, ecosystem function. Then they're bought in. So we eliminate the risk, so to speak. So with our clients, it's not risky at all. It's simply a matter of you have to understand and realize some farmers don't want to learn as quickly as others. You know, they have more of an aversion to risk. So you know, what's the old adage? You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. Well, we can teach these farmers, but they have to be willing to learn and understand and adapt accordingly. But when we do that, the success rate, our success rate is well over 90%. Yeah.
That's amazing.
That's
So
impressive.
it's not as difficult as what most people think. And not only farmers and ranchers, but gardeners also, because these same principles apply in a garden. I just did a TV show this morning. We talked about gardening.
Yeah,
I love it.
we use your practices in our little garden beds.
Great.
No tilling. We put mulch on top. We like
Yeah.
to do that kind of thing.
That's
So-
Yeah.
great. And the food tastes magnificent, doesn't it?
It's awesome.
It does.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so getting back to those 6 principles of soil health,
Mhm.
I'm wondering if you could just list off the 6 and then maybe
Yep.
we could just spend a little time on each principle.
Sure. So if you don't mind, at first, I'm going to talk about the 4 ecosystem processes, because those 4 ecosystem processes is what drives it all. We implement the 6 principles to drive the 4 ecosystem processes. So those 4 processes are, number 1, the energy cycle. And that simply is sunlight falling on the leaf tissue of a living plant. Photosynthesis occurs. That's solar energy being converted into living plants. Energy cycle. Second one is the nutrient cycle or mineral cycle. And what that is, that's what I talked about earlier. That's that plant taking those carbon compounds, then moving them down to the root, exuding them into the soil to attract and feed biology and mycorrhizal fungi. That's the nutrient cycle. You know, in the soil, it's a predator-prey relationship, just like on the plains of Africa. So you have all these bacteria being consumed by protozoa and nematodes. That provides nutrients to the plant, nutrient cycle. Third one is the water cycle, and the water cycle is driven by living plants. You know, there's a reason rainforests get more rain than does a desert. Living plant material, that's the small water cycle. Then you have to be able to infiltrate water into the soil. And that gets back to those living plants along the root of a living plant, where that's called the rhizosheath, and that's the interaction. Well, all soil is made up of sand, silt, and clay, held together by biotic glues. So soil aggregates are formed along that rhizosheath where you have that interaction. That makes soil, well-aggregated soil, looks like dark chocolate cake. And it's those pore spaces then that help infiltrate water. And it's in those pore spaces where biology lives. Biology lives in and on thin films of water in those pore spaces. So that's water cycle. And the 4th process is that of biodiversity. We talked about monocultures. Where in nature do you find a monoculture? Only where mankind's actions has either put them or caused them to occur. So nature abhors a monoculture. It thrives on diversity. So we need more of those on our farms, in our gardens, etc. So how do we get them? That's where we develop the 6 principles to drive those 4 processes. So the 6 principles, first principle is that of context. And we added this principle after my book was wrote. I give Ray Archuleta credit for insisting we add this principle, and he was absolutely right. All of our context is different. I live here in North Dakota. My context is way different than someone who lives in Mississippi, for instance. You have different moisture, you have different climate, different sunshine, wind blows differently, growing season is different, the plant species that grow is different. So all of those contexts are different, but then also each farm and ranch has, and garden, each individual family has a different context. How many family members are involved? What's your financial context? My financial context today is a lot different than it was after those 4 years of hail and drought. I'm much better off, so to speak, financially than I was back then. You have to take context into account. The second principle is least amount of disturbance possible. By that, we mean tillage disturbance. We mean disturbance from synthetic fertility. We mean disturbance from, composted manure. Too much composted manure is a bad thing. Okay, we can't have too much disturbance. Third principle, armor on the soil. We have to keep that soil covered. I'll ask the listeners, where in nature do you find bare soil? Only where mankind's actions have caused it to occur. And people say, well, in the desert, there's bare soil. Well, if you study history, there was no deserts thousands of years ago. Deserts are man-made. Just go back and read, and you'll see man caused that. Yet you look at farming today, many people go out, they till their field, they till their garden. They're actually causing negative effects, not only to the health of that soil, but to their own health or the health of those who consume products from that soil. So then the fourth principle is that of biodiversity. Diversity again. We need diversity of plants, animals, and insects. The fifth principle is living root in the soil as long as possible throughout the year. Look at cropland fields. They plant a corn crop or a wheat crop. They'll grow that crop, but then the field sits idle for the rest of the year. Well, nature doesn't act that way. That's why weeds come in a garden, right? That's why weeds come in a crop field. Nature wants to collect that solar energy. It wants to feed biology. Okay, we're not allowing that to happen. And the sixth principle, the final one, is that of livestock and insect integration. Where in nature do you find an ecosystem without animals and insects? Only in an unhealthy one. Nature wants animals. And as we help move farmers down this path, we have many who say, oh, I don't want any animals. Well, that's fine. We can advance your ecosystem so far, but it'll never be as healthy as it could be if you don't integrate animals. So those are the 6 principles that drive those 4 processes.
That's great. And just a few follow-up questions. I mean, the context, I love that principle. It makes perfect sense. I think here in Southern Oregon, occasionally Natalie and I'll see like banana trees. Just like what? It actually a funny story. The In-N-Out burger, they planted a palm tree when they, it's I guess a classic In-N-Out thing to have palm tree in the landscaping. It died. So great example of know your environment, know what plants do well, know what plants don't do well.
And I always use myself and our own farm as an example of that. For years, I calved in February in North Dakota. Well, if you've been to North Dakota in February, it's 20 below zero. How foolish was that?
Yeah.
Do you want a newborn life being taken from the womb into 20 below zero temperature? No, that's ridiculous. Now we calve in late May and June, when same time the deer drop their fawns. Calves are healthy, mothers are healthy. It's just, in
Amazing.
context with the environment.
Yeah. And then that second principle of avoid disturbing the soil, I mean, makes
Mhm.
complete sense to me to avoid the harmful pesticides, avoid the
Mhm.
tilling. You said though even avoid manure inputs that are at excess. Like how
Mhm.
would, a farmer kind of understand what that
Yeah,
balance is? Because I'm also hearing you say it's important to have
yeah.
manure in your system.
Big difference there. Manure that falls out of a grazing animal or an animal out on the land, it's that manure is full of biology because just our guts, the microbiome of us, of animals, it's full of good living organisms. That's in that manure. But when we take that manure, like in a CAFO situation, confined animal feeding operation, and then they have it in a liquid storage facility, a lot of compounds develop that are actually in the anaerobic environment that are actually negative to
Mm.
biology and the ecosystem. And so that's when it becomes a problem. Or even we've seen it, people compost manure along with, you can put anything in a compost pile. If you apply too much of that, it will negatively affect biology. So you have to be careful. But directly out of an animal, unless you locked them on an area and the manure piled up so deep, it's not going to be negative because it's living.
Awesome. I think I've heard somewhere too that uh, the the machinery that is used and like you because it's so heavy that it can disturb the soil
Yeah,
mycorrhizal network. Is that true? And do you have to worry about that with tractors and I don't know what kind of things?
yeah. Realize what you're talking about there is compaction. And
Mm,
you can have compaction. Compaction is simply the weight on the soil for too long, or if soil conditions were not appropriate. So if you have really wet conditions, you drive across it, you're going to compact that soil. I talked earlier about the aggregation in the soil. Think of it like marbles in a jar. You have each of those marbles is a soil aggregate. The pore spaces between those marbles allows water to infiltrate the home for biology. You drive over that with a piece of equipment, it's going to crush or compact that. That is negative. Now, if you have healthy soil that's well aggregated, it acts like a sponge. Think of it like a sponge. You push down on a sponge, what happens? It's resilient, it comes right back. So it depends on how healthy your soil is.
mm, awesome.
And that piece of the importance of animal inputs when farming, I know that people in the plant-based camp, you buy your vegetables at the store. There's this idea that there's no animal inputs.
Mm.
But then I know a lot of organic veggie farmers will use chicken manure, right? Or use
Mm.
some sort of manure that they're getting, probably from a feedlot. Is
Mm.
it possible for someone who's like, I don't want anything to do with animals,
Mm.
like animals and a landscape? Is it possible to have healthy soil without animal input?
Uh, you can have healthy soil, but you can make it much more healthy with animals.
Mm,
Okay. But it can be healthy. But I would say this, I am not telling people to eat all plant-based, be a carnivore. That's for each individual to decide. But I will tell them is that if they're truly concerned about their own health, though, they have to realize how soil functions. And I'll give you this as an example. I rarely do this, but I was asked once to debate a vegetarian. And they must have caught me in a mood where I said, yes, I would. But I said, I'll only do that if we get to ask each other a question at the end of the debate. So they agreed. And it was fine. It was cordial. I tried explaining ecosystems and that. But then they asked me a question. And then I asked the gal I was debating a question. And I asked her, how many plants did you eat today? And she said, well, I don't know, 12, 15. And I said, well, that animal that I ate that steak, where that steak came from, had access to well over 100 different plants the last day of its life. I'm more of a vegetarian than you are, is what I told her, right? But the point I was trying to get across was, when you understand phytonutrient compounds, phenols, alkaloids, terpenes, all these different amino acids, and how important they are to our gut microbiome, and understand that it's diversity that takes that. And what Dr. Stefan Van Vliet, Dr. Fred Provenza, Dr. Scott Kronberg are finding in the research they're doing is, it all gets back to biodiversity. You have to have more biodiversity in order to have more of those in a plant. Because realize, if you're a vegetarian, you're eating that one plant, those roots only travel so far. Okay, they only have access to the nutrients that the biology in that area provide. Now, how do they get more? It's through the mycorrhizal fungi, and it's through the diversity around them, where they're going to be able to access more and have more of these phytonutrients. So it's imperative that we have the diversity in our ecosystems to feed our gut microbiome what it needs.
Yeah. Do you think that we get a lot of that diversity through, because the animal, like if we're eating a cow and it's eating 100 different species,
Yeah.
we're getting all of that through eating the cow?
We are, and we're finding that out right now. In these studies are showing that. And
That's
it's
awesome.
not just a little bit. We're seeing like 239% higher.
Wow.
And there's actually papers in peer review right now, science, that is proving this out. And we're doing this on broad landscapes all over. I say we, but I mean the scientific community, you know? So we have to understand that it's all intricately related to the health of the soil. And this is why, and I don't mean to get off subject here, but you're seeing some people, oh, we got to go to hydroponics and we got to go to vertical farming. You will never, ever have the array and diversity of phytonutrients in a hydroponic situation, because it's the biology and it's lacking that biology. And I think this is going to come out more and more. I know it is, in the very near future. And we're going to see a major change of understanding and knowledge about this. The consumers are going to be more aware, and we're going to be able to arm consumers with the knowledge so they can make purchases based on the nutrient density of food, how it was grown and raised, how healthy were those soil ecosystems that where that food was grown or raised.
Yeah.
Not to mention how much, well, not to mention how much plastic is used for those other alternative farming practices. It's creative, but it's also wasteful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and to linger on this concept of diversity a bit longer, when farmers consulting you, or let's say a gardener like us, like what are your recommendations for diversity? Like when we're gardening in our backyard, we have two little garden beds, like how many plants should we go for? And with farmers, like how many plants? Do you speak a bit more to that?
Yeah, sure. And what I ask them is, what's your context? How big a garden do you have? Doesn't matter if it's 5 feet by 5 feet, 10 feet by 10 feet. I've talked to people in New York City who just have flower pots on the back deck of their apartment building. You can still do it. It's in context. So what we tell people is, you need to use your context. And then here I am, North Dakota. Well, the indigenous peoples along the Missouri River, centuries ago, they grew what was called the Three Sisters: corn, beans, and squash. Now, why did they put those three together? They wanted the corn for grain. Beans is a legume. Legumes can, through rhizobia, take atmospheric nitrogen out of the air put it into usable forms, feed biology, help transfer nitrogen, not only for that bean plant, but for the corn plant. Then they grew squash. Squash spreads, covers the ground. Remember, one of the principles, armor on the soil surface. These indigenous peoples knew that. So how much diversity do you want? Well, the beans and the squash were also flowering, so they attracted pollinator insects, attracted predator insects. It's important to realize for every insect species that's a pest, there's 1,700 that are beneficial or indifferent, meaning they won't either help you or hurt you. Too many gardeners, they see a pest, oh, I'm going to go get the spray and kill it, but they're killing those 1,700 beneficials. So how much diversity do you need? Well, what vegetables do you like to eat? Okay, you're going to plant that, but then you're also going to plant some flowers. You're going to plant a diverse array of maybe sunflowers, different heights, canopies, collect solar energy. What can fit in that space in your context? And people are going to say, yeah, but I can't have animals in my small garden, in the city. Well, you don't have animals, but you have that world of microbiology, the earthworms, the bees, the predator insects, the birds that come to your garden. You've got plenty of animals and insects that you can have.
Awesome. With the armor surfacing, I've heard you talk about your process and how you grow a cover crop and then you lay it down and then you have your cash crop maybe. So
Yep.
how long does it take for that whole process to happen? Growing the
Yep.
cover crop and then the cash crop and crop
and realize
harvest.
that's my context. That's how we make a living. So our cash crops are things like corn, spring wheat, oats, barley. Those take 90 to 110 days. So the cover crop would come after that or before that. Now I'm in an environment here in North Dakota, we only have about 110 frost-free days a year. But that doesn't mean that there's not cold tolerant species that we can grow to extend that and have something growing until the snow comes, So you can also, there's cover crops that in 30 to 45 days will produce ample cover to help you. So you have to fit it to your context. We work with farmers down south, Florida, etc., down along the Gulf Coast. They never do really freeze, so they can grow things all year. So then you grow it according to their context, select the species, etc.
Do you ever grow them at the same time? Do you ever have
We
that going on?
do on our farm, we do grow cover crops in with the cash crops. What's different there, though, the cash crop's always going to be the tallest one. So it's a species that's taller, so we can go in and harvest above the cover crops. The cover crops are going to be lower growing. So they just continue to grow and we're able to harvest our cash crops.
Awesome.
That there is becoming more and more of that done as
That's
people
awesome.
try to implement these principles.
Great. And how does that, can you go more into how that coverage impacts water retainment in the soil and prevents flooding even?
Sure. So it goes back to how a soil aggregate is formed. And I talked about sand, silt, and clay held together by biotic glues. We're forming those marbles then in that jar. An aggregate will only last about 4 weeks, and then biology consumes those glues, and you got to start over. So you have to be building. That's why that principle of living root in the soil as long as possible is so important. You need to continue to build those aggregates. As long as you have well aggregated soil, you're going to be able to infiltrate water. And that water will move throughout the soil profile. Then resiliency is dependent upon carbon. How much carbon? Think of carbon like a sponge. And we've found that the more carbon in the soil, it's called organic matter. The more higher the organic matter, the more water you're going to be able to hold. For every 1% increase in organic matter in your soil, you'll hold between 20 and 27,000 more gallons of water per acre. So when we bought our farm, it was about 1.7% organic matter. In other words, I could hold about 30,000, 35,000 gallons of water per acre. Now today we have some fields over 9%. Well, that's 180,000 gallons of water we can store per acre. So think of what that means for the watershed. Okay, we're not going to have the flooding. Every raindrop that falls is going to go into our soil. Then it's going to be held there due to the high amounts of carbon. That makes me very resilient to drought. It helps keep flooding from occurring downstream. And then because I have those living plants, we have the nutrients in living plants instead of being washed away to pollute downstream watersheds.
Mm-hmm.
And so, how much water do you all use on your farm in North Dakota in terms of irrigation,
Yeah.
in contrast to what you
Zero.
used before? Zero.
Zero. We have no irrigation. Well, there's no irrigation. It's whatever falls naturally. Yeah.
Wow.
That's awesome.
I know in
Yeah. And
Southern
that's for
Oregon,
much of the Midwest.
yeah,
There's not a lot of irrigation in the Midwest.
yeah.
Yeah.
I know a lot of farmers here in Southern Oregon have anxiety around water rights, access to water, and I love what you're talking about with these practices, increasing, you know, like 9, 10 times the amount of
Yeah.
water that you can hold in your soil.
And we work with a lot of farmers who own irrigated land, and you're correct, that's their big worry. But what we teach them and educate them is, okay, they know the trend, the aquifers are drying up. So how do they produce a crop with less water? This is how. It's called regenerative ag. It's called soil aggregates, organic matter. And what we're able to do is actually allow them to have profitable crop production with significantly less water, less irrigation. And that's huge. That's why we're putting on trainings for many different water districts, etc., to help them understand these principles.
Awesome. I think you already shared a bit about your first steps and process with those people, but is there anything else that you do for those farms that like what is the process like?
What we do with the new client, and realize it's going to vary according to their production. It'll vary a bit if they're a farmer, if they're a rancher, etc. But let's just use a farmer, for example. The first thing we do is we send out to their place one of our experienced consultants who's familiar with the crops they grow and their environment. And then they spend time with that farmer listening to understand their context. What are their challenges? They go around, they observe the farm, they stick a shovel in the ground, they look at the soils. Then we do proper soil testing. We have a suite of soil tests that we do that specifically tell us certain things. How much nutrients are in the soil? Okay. How much biology in the soil? How active is the biology? How much fungal components in the soil? We look at soil as a living ecosystem rather than a chemistry set. So we look at that based on their context and what they told us. We design and make recommendations based off that. Here's where we think you can see the greatest return for your time, dollars, and effort. And then we'll start there, keep very close, accurate records of profitability, infiltration rates, etc., to show them how they're advancing. When they see it with their own eyes on their own land, they're going to adopt these practices and principles very quickly.
That's awesome. And do you know if like how long it can take for glyphosate to get eliminated from like if someone was using glyphosate before and then they start these practices?
Yeah, and that's going to vary depending on a number of things. But the number one thing that will remediate that the quickest is biology. because biology will actually consume the carbon compounds in these chemicals. And so what we're finding is the healthier the soil ecosystem, the diversity and array of biology, the quicker we can remediate some of these synthetics, whether it be chemicals, pesticides, fungicides, etc.
Okay. That's so promising. There's really so much
Yeah.
hope when
Well, I'm just gonna tell you this because it is true and it will answer your question. In a very healthy soil ecosystem, we have farmers now, clients, that will use glyphosate pre-plant. So they'll go in and spray glyphosate before they seed a crop. Then they grow that crop, do not spray any chemicals, harvest that crop, and we're seeing zero residual of glyphosate in there. Why? Because the biology is so healthy that it's able to consume that. Now, they are moving away from it, okay? And it's their desire to not do any. But it's a process. You can't expect farmers just to stop cold turkey. They have to make a living. So what we're doing is how do you guide them down that path? And every year they're using less. That benefits all of us. Certainly benefits the food supply. Okay. So our goal is to move everyone to less over time.
That's awesome. Yeah, it really it does impact our gut bacteria too. If I don't know, sometimes the glyphosate is in the plants, it gets absorbed into the plants, right? Or sprayed on the plant. But it sounds like this practice is it's a strategic approach to wean off of that. You're using it before, it's not directly on the plant. The soil aggregates are breaking that down. And it's like a preventative
The biology in the soil is breaking it down.
yes.
Yep, you're exactly right. It's the biology. The other thing, if you have a healthy soil microbiome with an array of biology, it'll actually help that plant ward off any of these diseases and pests and that. So there's no reason for spraying those pesticides or chemicals.
That's awesome.
Gabe, so in preparing for this interview, I watched a YouTube video that you posted, and you were out on one of your fields. You had uh, baled hay in this field and in the fall, and you had, I mean, it looked like hundreds of giant bales of hay, and you were talking about how you were doing this in preparation for the winter months. Your goal is for the cattle to eat fresh grass, but in the case that you run out of pasture for them to graze on, you would take them into these sections of hay. And I just got so excited seeing it all there because I thought how creative, and it's such a chore to move the hay around. I see a lot of farmers buying hay and they've got huge hay barns, and then you've got to just port it with fossil fuels. And you said I think it took you an hour to bale it. So one, efficient use of time, two, efficient use of fuel. Could you just speak a bit more to that practice in particular?
Sure. So that's a practice we call bale graze. And I actually learned that from my friends in Canada back at the turn of the century. They were doing it. There were several people up there who started doing it. And it still takes you more than that time to bale the hay.
Okay.
But the thing is, we're trying to feed it on the same land where we bale it.
Yeah.
And then for years, what most ranchers do in the winter time, our animals don't really run out of grazing on our ranch. It's just that the snow gets too deep. Okay. And we can graze through about 30 inches of snow, but when it gets much deeper than that, it becomes physically hard for them to do. Imagine the bison out in the winter, and they do it because they travel and find areas where it's blown clean or snow hasn't accumulated. Well, our ranch is a fixed asset, so there's only so many places they can go. So what we do is we go onto a particular field. We will bale the hay, but we leave the hay there. At times we may bring in a little more hay to put there. But then what takes me an hour to do is if we have to bring more hay bales on, we'll set them out in that field, and that's done in the fall of the year. Then it takes about an hour. We go out there and we actually push our electric fence posts in every so often. We space it so about a week's worth of hay, and then would have a new set of fence posts, another week's worth. And then all we do is once a week, we just go string our little electric fence wire and turn the cattle into new bales. So think of what that does. During the winter, I only have to go out there once a week, string that wire. The animals are feeding themselves on that hay. So I don't have to start tractors every day. I don't have to haul it to a corral. Then what happens in the spring, you got to haul that manure out of the corral. Plus, think of health of the animal. They're not standing there in that dirty corral, right? They're not standing in manure. No, they're out grazing where they want to be, eating that hay out on a field, and then we're turning them into fresh hay every week. Spring of the year, for one thing, I didn't have to start a tractor all winter every day, but then I don't have manure to haul. The next year, that pasture we fed in is just lush because it has all that dung and urine on it. The old hay gets broken down, and now what we're doing, we turn our pigs in there the year after we bale graze on there. That's summer. So our pigs are in there rooting around, spreading that. Then our laying hens, we run 1,600 laying hens are out on there too. And it's more mimicking a natural ecosystem. It saves us a lot of time and dollars. And then one important thing is we do not put up hay on the same acres every year. So where we bale graze, I don't think now, we still haven't bale grazed. I've been bale grazing for well over 20 years. We still haven't bale grazed on the same field twice yet. We're moving that around because we'll only do that on maybe 20 to 40 acres a winter, and then you're on to the next one next year. That way your plants recover, and the animals are on a different piece the next year. It works extremely well.
Yeah.
And then I'm curious I know in Southern Oregon, we're a very different region than you in terms of getting a lot more rain opposed to snow in the winter months. Would you think bale grazing would work in a region like ours where we get so much rain, or would that make the hay
Well,
moldy or
it'll work to a point. Yes, it'll work. And we have clients doing that. I've seen bale grazing work in areas with 200 inches of rainfall a year, and you're certainly not anywhere
no?
near that high.
Mm-mm.
So it'll work. The only thing is you couldn't leave the hay out for more than 1 year because the amount of rain you get, there'll be too much spoilage. But you could put it out in the fall of the year, or you could bale it in a field, leave it and have it fed up that next winter. If you're in a real wet environment, you may have to move that fence every day or two because what's going to happen, leaving them on the same area, it gets that compaction we talked about earlier to where the soil just breaks down then. But it'll heal very quickly, even if it does, we call that pugging it up. It pugs up the soil. It'll heal very quickly if you just leave it alone.
Yeah.
It'll recover.
And then
How
oh, sorry, one more question with this, with the rotational grazing, I know the idea is to mimic, these cycles where predators would be, for example, predators would be,
Mhm.
chasing the bison throughout North America, and they would spend very little time in a given area. Generally speaking, are you moving cattle daily, multiple times a day, with less
Mhm.
frequency? Does it just vary a ton?
Mhm. So we call it adaptive grazing. And the reason we call it adaptive grazing is because we have to observe what nature is telling us. The key component with adaptive grazing, you have to allow ample time for those plants to recover. Once a plant is grazed by an animal, given adequate moisture and sunlight, that plant's going to start regrowing in about 3 to 4 days. If you leave them on there longer than that and they come back and graze that same plant, that plant's going to slough off root reserves and you can kill that plant. Okay. So what we do on our ranch during the growing season, we're moving the animals every day. Okay, sometimes more than once a day if we so choose. In our environment, it takes 12 to 15 months for that plant to recover because it has to recover during the growing season. And remember, we have a very short growing season. So that's why it takes so long. In a wetter environment, like say we go down to Mississippi, where the growing season is essentially year round, it may only take 60 to 100 days for that plant to recover. Okay, so they can graze it more often. But the key is they're not going to leave them on there very long time. Now, in saying that, it has to fit your context. Okay, so we have ranches in New Mexico, for instance, very large acreages, 100,000 plus acres. And I know there's ranches like that in Eastern Oregon also. I've been on many of them. There, you are not going to be moving them every day. There's simply not enough forage out there. It's too brittle of an environment. But maybe you're moving them once every 2 weeks. That's better than leaving them on all year. So it has to fit your context. And I tell people when I started down this path, I went from just not moving them at all. They were on the same pasture all the growing season. Then we started moving them once a month, then once every 2 weeks, then once a week. And now we've, for the last 15 years, we've been every day. But that's by our choice. And what we found is our profitability kept going up. The more we moved them, the more forage we produced, the more profit we made.
And how do you find the growing season in your area? Is it just based on when the snow falls or if snow falls that year? Because
So,
it can
a
change.
great question. So, we get our last frost typically about mid-May and our first one in mid-September. So, people think that's the growing season. But what I've found, for instance, this past year, we didn't have a lot of snow. I have pictures the 26th of December of green growing plants. Even though the air temperature is only 20 degrees outside, those plants are still photosynthesizing, collecting sunlight. So I consider my growing season all year long, essentially. Now, when we get 100 inches of snow covering it, it's not going to grow much. But in saying that, as soon as it starts melting, we're going to have things will start growing.
I noticed that here too. I mean, we don't get a ton of snow in the valley, so
Mhm.
I think it's constant, it
Mhm.
seems like.
Yeah. And so capture that solar energy as long as possible. Why
Mhm.
not?
Um,
Yeah,
Cool.
Absolutely. I wanted to ask you a practical gardening question.
sure.
So we've done sheep mulching, and what we found was that we get a lot of slugs, and I wish we could, get some ducks. I've heard ducks really like slugs, but we're just in, condominiums here, and we wouldn't be allowed to. Like,
Mhm.
yeah, I know you're in talking about pest, you're like for every, pest, there's hundreds
Mhm.
of like beneficial insects and that sort of thing. But like, how would you go about,
Yeah,
contending with the slugs?
yeah, and realize I would want to see how well aggregated your soil is. I would ask you, do you see fireflies at night?
Mm-mm.
Fireflies are a big consumer of slug larvae.
Oh.
So you see fireflies, they're going to consume. We actually have some what do I want to call it? Data bulletins on slugs and how to control them in natural ways, just to attract predators, etc.
Oh,
I'd be happy to get those to you.
Oh.
But it's all about getting the diversity. So we do a lot of work in England, major slug problems because they're damp, wet environment. But what we find is as they build aggregation, as their natural nutrient cycle uh, um, improves, slug issues go down, and it becomes much less of an issue.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
How important is we have a small tumbler composter
Nice.
and we just do our like food scraps and and things like that.
Mhm.
So, how important is that in a small ecosystem like we have in our veggie garden?
Sure, use it. Use
Use
it.
it. Okay.
I'm a big proponent of compost. In saying that, realize our ranch 6,000 acres. You can't make enough compost cover 6,000 acres. But I would rather see it's all a food source for biology. So use it. Just don't put on a thick layer. Make
Yeah.
sure it's thin and
Okay.
absolutely it'll be a wonderful amendment.
And you just say layer it on instead of mixing
Well,
it
I
in.
say spread it fairly
Yeah.
thin.
Okay.
In fact, you'd want one here, one here. You don't want a thick layer of,
Okay. Okay.
yeah.
Nice. Thank
Mhm.
you. Those are great practical tips for us.
And Gabe, I noticed you have the Common Ground hat on right now, and that's a new documentary. I watched the trailer for. I don't think it's out yet, but we really want to watch it. Will you just speak a bit about that project?
Yeah. So the original first documentary in the series was called Kiss the Ground, and that they actually started filming at my place in 2014 on that one. It was released in 2019. And a little bit about how Common Ground came to being. So one of my clients watched Common Kiss the Ground, and he called me up and he said, Gabe, that was good, but I think we need to go more in depth. Do you know the producers? And I said, oh, of course, they spent enough time at my ranch. And so he asked me to do an introduction, and I did. And he actually funded Common Ground himself.
Wow.
And that documentary took less than 2 years from when they met till it was out. It debuted last January. It's been shown in select theaters around the world. It'll be released on Amazon in January, so it'll be available. And now the trilogy to that is called Groundswell, and that's going to cover worldwide, and that will be out in 2027. So there's three of them in the series. Common Ground really focuses on the issue of production ag. How did we get to this point where we're being so harmful to the ecosystem? And then how do we change it? And how do we go about driving regenerative agriculture to become the norm? And Groundswell, the trilogy, is going to focus on how that's being done worldwide. Yeah. And it's exciting because I get to travel all over and I see great examples all over the world of people making a difference and educating themselves and others, like you're doing with this podcast, to, hey, we all need to come together, find common ground for common good, and really change the way we're doing things.
And would
I
you
think
mind sharing one of those stories that has stuck with you, seeing someone take all this information that we're talking about and make some shift that has been really hopeful and encouraging to you?
Sure, I'll give you an example here in North Dakota. So the fall of 2018, I had a younger farmer, young family reach out to me, and he said, all rented ground, no own land. And he said, Gabe, I'm just struggling. We're making money, but all I do is pay the bank and pay my input suppliers. And he said, I'm just wearing myself out. And he says, explain to me about regenerative ag. So I got him to one of our 3-day soil health academies. Most importantly, I got him to bring his wife. So both of them went through, educated them, and he already was no-till, had a fairly diverse crop rotation. We talked him into diversifying a little more, looking at some of these lesser known crops to spread out his risk and to give him more diversity. But then where he really shined is he would harvest a crop one afternoon, a field. The next morning, he was in it seeding the cover crop. I mean, he became that intentional, started eliminated the use of insecticides right away, started making Johnson Sioux compost and using that on the seed to put biology on the seed. Instead of spreading compost, he had 4,500 acres. He couldn't make enough compost. So he was using it as a seed inoculum. Okay. Fast forward, this past winter, he called me up and he asked if he could stop by my house. And he told me, Gabe, this is the difference it's made. I went from struggling to now the last 2 years have been our two most profitable years. And he said, this winter, I bought a half a section, 320 acres of farm ground, and he paid cash. Okay. 320 acres cash in North Dakota, you're talking $750,000,
Wow.
approximately. And he paid
That's
cash.
amazing.
And he said and he was about in tears. He said the thing he was most happy about, his two children who are in high school, they're talking about coming back and farming. And to me, that's the story. That's why I do what I do right there. It's wonderful,
It is.
and we hear that over and over again. You really, regenerative not only means we regenerate the soil, but we regenerate our souls and our purpose, our communities, etc. Yep.
Yeah, I remember the first time I heard about you was on the Kiss the Ground documentary. And I think if people could just see and more people see I love what you do with the difference between, I think it was your neighbor's farm or
Yeah.
ranch
My
and
neighbors
yours.
might not like that,
But maybe it's changed now after seeing
yeah.
if they're open. But I mean, it speaks loudly to anybody who sees that
Mhm.
it's worth looking into more. It's awesome.
Well, the thing is that, there's a lot of naysayers. Oh, it won't work here. And I tell them, yeah, with that attitude, it won't. But you know what? It's like Henry Ford said, whether you think you can or you think you cannot, you're correct. And nobody can argue what we teach. The four ecosystem processes are the four processes. Nobody can argue that. What, doesn't sun shine on your place? Don't plants collect sunshine? You can't argue those. And you can't argue the principles because these are time-tested ecological principles that have been around for eons of time. Nobody can argue that, you know? You can't argue creation. It is what it is. So,
It is.
yeah.
It is.
And I love. Oh, go
I have
ahead.
one more. You had mentioned about the predator experience between the protozoa and the bacteria.
Mhm.
And I work with nutrition and gut health, and I'm always
Mhm.
kind of approaching the gut microbiome in a similar way and talking about how, protozoa aren't, or like parasites aren't necessarily bad. They're not the major problem, even if we do have symptoms from them. That just means something else is wrong. Can you, I want to learn more about this. Can you, what is going on with that
Mhm.
in the soil, and how could we adapt that to our own bodies
Yeah,
somehow?
and I'll reference a few books that will certainly help the listeners. I
Awesome.
encourage you, if you're gardeners or if you're farmers, read Jeff Lowenfels has a series of books, Teaming with Microbes, Teaming with Fungi. Those are great books that explain these relationships in the soil. There's also a really good one called Mycorrhizal Planet. That's a very good book that talks about mycorrhizal fungi and how important it is. And I could get really deep into this if you wanted, about how mycorrhizal fungi connect different plants to each other, and so plants are actually communicating with each other through the mycorrhizal fungi. One plant can send out root exudates to attract biology to bring it a certain nutrient. The plant next to it is able to sense that. It sends out different signals. It's a whole communication network occurring beneath our feet that we don't even begin to understand, and let alone take advantage of. I tell people what got us out of debt so far is I just became smart enough to realize nature was much more intelligent than I. Why don't I take a step back and let her do the work? And I did. Now, I got a much bigger belly because of that, but that's simply because I became lazier, But it really is very enjoyable to work with nature instead of against her.
Yeah.
Gabe, well, in talking with you, I experienced like this hopefulness, and I really appreciate that, like how focused you are on the health of soil, the health of our communities, the health of planet, and just the concrete actions you've taken on your farm, and then bringing that to other farms because it is really at the heart of the ecological environmental issues we face, as well as the health crises that we're experiencing. So just
Yeah.
sincere gratitude. Thank you so much
Yeah.
for your work and for inspiring uh, farmers like this man you're talking about, as children, to
Mhm.
continue. And just one more question before we wrap up here. How do you see your legacy? Like if people were to look back 100 years from now, like what you have so many great ideas. What would you want them to remember most?
I don't want them to remember a single thing about me. That's not what's important to me. What's important to me is, the indigenous peoples had a saying about 7 generations. Decisions they're making are going to impact 7 generations down the road. It's my hope that what I'm helping to teach and educate will influence 7 generations down the road. That to me is more important. It's more, sustainable is a buzzword. Everybody says they want to be sustainable. We can't afford to be sustainable. We got to be regenerative first. So future generations have the opportunity to be sustainable because we've
Mm.
degraded it so much. So that's my hope, is that we get to that point where this is common. Regenerative agriculture, we won't be having, it's my hope in the future, conversations like this won't need to take place because everybody will realize that and be doing it.
That's
That's
great.
beautiful.
Yeah.
I want that too.
Yes.
And then
Thank you.
in closing here, Gabe, if people are interested in learning more of your work, you mentioned a number of helpful resources throughout the interview. I'll link those in the show notes. But if people are interested in learning more about your work, where's a good place to direct them?
Yeah, so they can go to understandingag.com. They can go to soilhealthacademy.org, or they can go to Regenified, and that's a made up word, regenified.com. They can also read my book, Dirt to Soil. And I'll put out a tease. We're working on another book, so it'll be a while, but we're working on it. So yeah.
Mm.
Awesome. Very
All right.
exciting.
Well, thank you so much, Gabe, for taking the time. Really valued this conversation.
Well, thank you, both of you. Keep up the good work. Enjoy what you're doing.